Hello, and welcome to the Irish Aesthete. Previously, I explained the background to Shellhouses and how the wonderful Mrs. Delaney helped make them popular here in Ireland. The craze very quickly spread around the country. Indeed, already by the mid-1740s, it had become so widespread that Charles Smith in County Waterford was complaining that shells along the local coastline had become hard to find since, he said, the making of shell houses and grottos came into fashion. 4 decades later, it was reported the extravagant first Marquis of Donegal had acquired £10,000 worth of shells, not yet unpacked. Almost all the buildings for which these shells were destined have long since disappeared. But today, I want to look at 2 examples which have survived, the first of them being at Carton, County Kildare. Carton was, for many centuries, the principal seat of Ireland's premier family, the Fitzgeralds, long-time Earls of Kildare. In 1747, James the 20th Earl, who'd be created first Duke of Leinster 19 years later, married Lady Emily Lennox, a daughter of the second Duke of Richmond. Accordingly, she came to live with her husband at Carton, where the house had recently been renovated and extended to the designs of the period's foremost architect, Richard Castle. However, that didn't stop the forthright Emily from putting her own stamp to the place, as can be seen in this portrait of the couple by Arthur Devis, painted in 1755. Notice how, while James calmly gazes at us, his wife is busy poring over architectural plans for a new bridge in Carton's domain. One of the spots that especially engaged her attention was a former workman's cottage called Waterstone, its name due to the fact that the site is just above a weir on the River Rye. In the spring of 1766, she transformed this into what has since become known as the Shell Cottage. Emily had the advantage of being able to draw on experience, because many years earlier, while still living with her family at Goodwood, the Richmond seat in Sussex, she'd helped her mother to create a shell grotto in the grounds, which still survives. Now, Carton's shell cottage was enlarged and its exterior altered around 1849 in anticipation of a visit to the place by Queen Victoria, but the interior as conceived by Emily remains. While she certainly designed the space, the walls divided into geometric patterns by lengths of stained bamboo, the actual labour appears to have been carried out by workmen on the estate. And not only shells were used, but also pieces of coral and crystal, fossils, and fragments of broken crockery and glassware. Carton's shell house has none of the strict formality that we see in its equivalent at Goodwood. But there is definitely a scheme at work here, one devised beforehand by Emily. In September 1766, her younger sister Louisa could write to another sibling that Emily has amused herself very much with Waterstone, which is just finished, and a dear thing it is, as you never saw. I'm sure you would dote upon it. It's the most comfortable-looking place that can be. Well, I'm not quite sure that comfortable is the first word springing to mind when describing the space, but it's certainly very distinctive. Incidentally, some of you may recognise the Shell Cottage's interior from an early scene in Stanley Kubrick's 1975 film Barry Lyndon. And now let's look at another wonderful shell house, this time in County Waterford, where Charles Smith had been grumbling about the absence of shells on the coastline, probably because they were all being used in this building. It stands in the grounds of Curramore, one of Ireland's finest country houses, and for many centuries now, the home of the Dulaper Beresfords, today Marquises of Waterford. In 1717, the 15-year-old heiress to the Curramore estate, Catherine Dulaper, had married her cousin, Sir Marcus Beresford. The couple would have 3 sons and 6 daughters, all of whom dressed up in Van Dyck costumes for a group portrait. Like Emily at Carton, Catherine was a woman of spirit and energy who always needed something to be doing with herself, and one of the things she did was to create her own shell house. As is so often the case with these buildings, The exterior gives little indication of what can be found within. The building takes the form of a Greek cross, with walls constructed of uncut but slightly rounded stones and a stone-flagged roof. Inside, almost the entire surface is smothered in an enormous variety of shells, arranged axially around the largest central space, with 3 circular apses, each containing a window, and a small rectangular entrance lobby. Meanwhile, the floor is covered in an equally elaborate pattern worked in pebbles. Where did all the shells for this and other similar buildings come from? Well, no doubt some of them were picked up locally on beaches, just as Charles Smith had been complaining, but others had a more exotic background. In fact, there was a quiet, not quite illicit but unofficial trade in shells brought back to Europe from around the rest of the world by sailors who were returning here from overseas. This was a way for them to supplement their income. Catherine would probably have been able to buy the shells from vessels in the busy harbour of Waterford and then bring them home to Curramore. But it would have taken a long time to build up enough shells to fill the entire space and to work out a satisfactory design for their arrangement. In the middle of Curramore's shell house stands a life-size white marble statue of Catherine by John Van Nost. In one hand, appropriately enough, she holds a conch shell, and in the other a scroll. On this is carved a brief text informing us that, in 261 days, these shells were put up by the proper hands of the Right Honourable Catherine, Countess of Tyrone, 1754. What this indicates is that, unlike Emily in the shell house at Carton, Catherine had actually undertaken all the workmanship herself. One final point. How did she manage to get the shells to stay in place? Seemingly, they're fixed onto the walls with a glue made of boiled up ox blood and animal hooves, which can't have emitted a very attractive smell. But it did the job. Because almost all the shells are still in situ, more than 260 years after being put there, and making the shell house at Curramore a very precious survivor of this 18th century architectural craze. Thank you very much for watching The Irish Aesthete. I look forward to seeing you again next week. Goodbye.